Welcome, everyone. If you're just joining, please go ahead and enter in the chat your name, your pronouns, your borough, and what you'd like to learn from this workshop today. And we will begin very shortly. All right, so we're at 6:35, so perhaps we can get started now. So again, welcome everyone. Before we get into the presentation for tonight, we'd like to share a little bit about climate reality for those of you who are new to the organization. The Climate Reality Project was founded by former Vice President Al Gore to catalyze a global solution to the climate crisis by making urgent action a necessity across every sector of society. Climate Reality recruits, trains, and mobilizes people of all walks of life to become climate reality leaders and work for just climate solutions. Our New York City Metro chapter is one of many chapters across the country, and there are branches around the world. And we engage climate reality leaders in the New York City metropolitan area with in-person and virtual events like this one, as well as our working groups or teams. Anyone is welcome to join our chapter if you aren't already a member, and members can sign up for any of our teams. Currently, we have an advocacy team, an Electrify NYC team, and our Stewardship Impact Collective. And so if you'd like to learn more about any of these, as well as upcoming events and calls to action, you can visit our Linktree by scanning the QR code on the screen or through the link that will be shared in the chat. All right, so now on to our speaker. We're pleased to welcome back Joseph Staluppi, a climate reality leader and key member of our Electrify NYC team. Joseph is here tonight in his professional capacity as an account manager with the New York City Accelerator, where he focuses on providing technical assistance for building stakeholders, pursuing decarbonization and local law 97 compliance efforts, other local laws as well. So now I'm going to hand it over to Joseph.
Thanks, Deepa. Appreciate it. And good evening, everybody. I see some familiar faces and names. I've certainly had conversations, support sessions with many people here. I've even co-hosted some events with some familiar names here. So this is great. I appreciate the engagement and the curiosity to learn more and the drive to ensure that NYC's decarbonization goes smoothly. We have an opportunity to lead at a global scale as it relates to the fight against the climate crisis. So I'll briefly introduce myself for those who I haven't had the pleasure of meeting yet. Again, my name is Joseph Staluppi. I trained as a climate reality project leader back in 2017. It was at the Pittsburgh training, in case anyone was able to make it to that one. It was pretty good. Since then, I've gone back and forth between where I'm currently at in Westchester as well as Brooklyn. So I've helped out the chapter in Westchester. I've helped out the chapter here. I've gone to many of the New York State Coalition meetings up at the Ashokan Center. So it's really great to, continually meet more of the local New York City community chapter. I'm here today to give everyone a technical briefing on New York City's crux to the Climate Mobilization Act, which is Local Law 97. If anyone is unfamiliar with the Climate Mobilization Act and Local Law 97, I'm going to provide you with a formal presentation. So I will share my screen. Please note that I have some fellow Climate Reality members also on this call that are taking actionable steps towards Local Law 97 compliance for their buildings. So after this presentation, we'll be having a informal panel followed by a Q&A. If you have any questions on any of the contents that I'll be presenting on, feel free to put those questions in the chat so that Paul can log them and bring them up as the moderator. So without further ado, I will get started with a brief agenda, which will include a program overview on NYC Accelerator, a primer on the Climate Mobilization Act and Local Law 97, and I'll briefly touch upon various funding mechanisms, such as incentives or financing assistance that the New York City Accelerator can help you tap into. I know there's a lot of moving parts, a lot of changes, both at the state and federal level. We're going through a really incredible transition in terms of industry, moving away from the more tried and true, lower hanging fruit efficiency measures, trying to bolster up, large scale building envelope and electrification. So we're at a really exciting time. And then, as I mentioned, we'll get into a Q&A. So right off the bat, I just want to set some context here in terms of why we're protecting NYC's future. Nearly 70% of the greenhouse gas emissions that make up the carbon footprint of New York City come from buildings. That remaining 30% would be contributable to transportation and waste. And all of those buildings are here to stay. There's very small, there's of course new construction happening throughout the city, but we're really trying to decarbonize existing buildings. Many of these are old buildings, so the real key towards helping New York City achieve its decarbonization goals lies in the success of Local Law 97. So that's where the New York City Accelerator comes in. We are a free technical assistance program that is funded through the Mayor's Office of Climate and Environmental Justice. And our job is to deliver expert advice to determine various requirements and help meet local law compliance, to provide technical assistance for building upgrades, identify the applicable financial incentive programs, financing, etc. We also have a large vendor network, so we have service providers that can actually perform such energy and carbon reduction projects. I saw one of the individuals in the chat is actually part of the Accelerator service provider network. That's exciting to see. And then, in case anyone's interested in a little bit of education, we also have no-cost online trainings for building operators and stakeholders. So you just Google NYC Accelerator, poke around the website, you might be able to find some really interesting rabbit holes to bring yourself down. So at a high level, you learn about the program, what we do. We'll then connect with someone like myself, an account manager, where I will walk you through a building needs assessment. I'll get into what that would look like on the next slide, which will then inform what energy conservation measures may apply to such buildings. And then we have that conversation about how to implement the measures, which vendors you may need to bring in, which incentives or tax credits or, various rebates, financial loans could apply. And then we stay in touch. I'm more or less an owner's rep at that point, and I'll be able to support with bid comparison, be able to craft RFP messages. I'd be able to help, you know, support via interviews, next step conversations. I've been on so many board meetings. It's been a wild time. So here's what some of that building needs assessment may look like. First, I will, of course, get the list or, individual properties so that I can review the benchmarking data. I will get into what benchmarking means in case anyone is unfamiliar, but it's more or less the data that informs those letter grades that you see on the entrance. So we'll take a look at the historic energy usage and then from there determine, what the local law 97 compliance pathways could look like, whether, there's an opportunity to follow one of, I'll get into the various buckets which buildings may fall into, but there's different pathways. So that's where we come in, may have to do with the number of rent regulated units. There's different prioritization action items that may follow. And then from there, we start with determining the applicable measures, maybe reviewing energy audits, opportunities based off the building typology. Is it commercial on the ground floor? Is it multifamily, like a garden style? We'll find out. And then, yeah, as I mentioned, we are, discussing the sequencing of projects from there. On that implementation plan, as I mentioned, there is an opportunity for financial support. So we have a vendor network, but we also have a capital provider network. So once you have a proposal, a scope of work, and a proposed project budget, we'll be able to connect you to one of, I think we have roughly 15 capital providers in our network. So we'll be able to match you up accordingly. And this is all after various utility incentives or state incentives have been applied. So it's a pretty holistic approach towards just extra hand holding. You can think of us as a help desk. It's really great. Any building that is above 5,000 square feet is eligible for our assistance. So even if your building is not covered by Local Law 97, because that requirement is a building on a tax lot that is above 25,000 square feet, there's still opportunities for you to, of course, decarbonize. There's some, adjacent local laws that you need to be aware of, such as the phasing out of number four fuel oil. There's the sunsetting of some of the more traditional incentive programs, such as lighting, things of that nature. So there's always ways for you to improve your building's performance. The only thing is that if it's below 5 dwelling units, you're considered to be in the small residential sector, for which you can go to one of the NYSERDA regional clean energy hubs for technical assistance. So once you have determined your building's eligibility, you call us or you get in contact with myself as an account manager. We'll provide objective advice customized to your needs. And as I mentioned, it's completely free. So there's no catch, there's no commitment. You can come and go as you please. If you want to just have a phone call and be done with it, that's completely fine. So I would like to pivot a bit and now just talk about the Climate Mobilization Act and Local Law 97 specifically. The Climate Mobilization Act is the largest climate solution put forth by any city in the world, which consists of a slate of climate laws designed to dramatically cut carbon in New York City. Central to the Climate Mobilization Act, as I mentioned, is Local Law 97, first of its kind legislation placing emission limits on New York City's largest buildings. So if we're thinking back to that first slide where I mentioned that 70% of New York City's emissions come from buildings. 30% of that 70 come from Local Law 97 subject buildings, and that's a building that is above 25,000 square feet. There's some nuances to be aware of when there's numerous buildings on one tax lot, but I'm trying to keep it pretty high level for this presentation. So just think of a building that's above 25,000 square feet. By that logic, that means that the Local Law 97 covered buildings represents that emission piece of the pie equatable to waste and transportation. So it's a pretty large piece of the puzzle. And we can imagine that for New York City to achieve its decarbonization goals, which more or less mirrors the state level decarbonization work through the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, in order for there to be success, all aspects of that pie chart need to be addressed. So I wouldn't be surprised if at some point we see smaller buildings follow similar emission limits. But right now, in terms of legality and legislation, we are focused in on New York City's largest buildings. So there is a little bit of context that everyone should know as it relates to the local laws that were put in place back in 2009 through the Greener Greater Buildings Plan. And that introduced various local laws, such as Local Law 84, which has to do with benchmarking. It was later amended in 2016 to cover all buildings above 25,000 square feet. Just that one caveat. It all started with buildings 50,000. So there's some differences in terms of the square footage threshold. That is the requirement to submit energy and water consumption annually. So it's record keeping. It also introduced a law known as Local Law 87. That one is for buildings above 50,000 square feet. It requires an energy audit and the completion of retro commissioning work once every 10 years. So it's a great way to develop a roadmap and to keep up to date with proper operation and maintenance of buildings. It's actually recommended to complete retro commissioning work once every 3 to 5 years. So the requirement to do it once every 10 years is very, bare bones minimal, but it's a good way to keep your building operating as it was intended during the time of construction and commissioning. The Greener Greater Buildings Plan also introduced something known as Local Law 88, which again is for buildings above 25,000 square feet. This requires those buildings to upgrade their lighting systems to comply with an applicable version of the New York City Energy Conservation Code. And it's actually due this year. So it's been around for 15 years, and many buildings that I work with these days are still struggling to figure out if they are, in fact, in compliance with Local Law 88 or not, because there have been many gray areas as it relates to how to follow the energy code, how to demonstrate that the lighting systems are in compliance with the energy conservation code. So that's where we come in to help you assess your needs and put you on the path towards compliance. Now, fast forward a bit to 2019. It introduced various laws such as the building efficiency grades. There is a local law that has to do with implementing solar and green roofs on your roof if there is a replacement or a major renovation. It also introduced Local Law 96, which has to do with property assessed clean energy financing. And now is when we get into the major laws, Local Law 97, placing greenhouse gas emission limits on buildings above 25,000 square feet. And also, it's worth noting that Local Law 154 is also currently in effect, which mandates that all newly constructed buildings go all electric, so no natural gas or oil fired new buildings, with various deadlines to be aware of. But I'm not going to be focusing in on that because, we all live in buildings today that are in need of retrofits. And in general, there are varying deadlines to be aware of. I have noticed in my work that the Department of Buildings is being quite lenient with the first of its kind reporting for many of these local laws as it relates to the Local Law 84, Local Law 88, Local Law 97, because they're all kind of combined in a way. So there's various extensions that are currently going on. The main takeaway that I want everyone to get out of this conversation is that your building is unique and there's a specific pathway that applies to your building that you need to be aware of. And myself, as well as some of the climate reality members here who are closely tracking this, can support your building in identifying the appropriate solution. I would like to show everyone a nice little Candyland style slide that shows you how all of these local laws fit into each other. So if you're starting at the top left, you can see that there are hilariously gray colored clouds representing dollar signs that would equate to your emissions, and associated is a D letter graded building. And of course, all of those data points are coming from your benchmarking. So that's your baseline. From there, you can conduct, an energy audit, do some retro commissioning work, figure out if there's a more comprehensive or building wide project that you can take on. You consider what financing is available. You consider what incentives are available. You move forward with those projects. Maybe it's, an easy one is to do your Local Law 88 lighting or to upgrade your heating systems if applicable, solar, green roof, etc. And then that following year, you've noticed that the hilariously colored clouds are now cleaner. It's a better letter grade. It's representing a more efficient building, reflecting the data used for benchmarking. So they're all interconnected, but each play a specific role. Moving on to which bucket applies as it relates to Local Law 97. In general, you can keep these two terms in mind, Article 320 and Article 321. Generally speaking, Article 320 buildings represent market rate buildings. So that could be market rate residential or it can be commercial buildings. And they typically follow what is known as the performance pathway. And that is when buildings above 25,000 square feet need to meet their carbon reduction targets year after year with various limit periods that ultimately go down to carbon neutrality by 2050. So right now we are in the first carbon emission limit period, which spans from 2024 to 2029. Beginning in 2030 is the first stringent dip in your allowable carbon emission limits. It represents nearly a 40% decrease in emissions. And then there's the next period, 2035 to 2039, 2040 to 2049, and then, as I mentioned, carbon neutrality by 2050. So, under these current conditions, many buildings are, in fact, compliant with the emission limits set today. A recent Urban Green Council report estimated, based off of previous benchmarking data, nearly 90% of properties subject to Local Law 97 meet the emission limits set today. But the reverse is almost true for the more stringent 2030 to 2034 limits, and so on and so forth. So, right now, my pedagogy is to understand where your building falls, implement as many low-hanging fruit measures as possible, understand your true baseline, and figure out what is the expected effective useful life on my equipment? Am I anticipating an upcoming failure? Are there ways to incorporate, some of this anticipated project work and costs into our next mortgage? Things of that nature come into the conversation when working one-on-one. So that's my general pedagogy. I would like to note that there is also something known as Article 321. It's generally around for affordable housing buildings, but there's also an opportunity for certain houses of worships to follow this. I'll get into which types of affordable housing qualify for this in my next slide, but there are alternative compliance pathways that one could meet for their Local Law 97 compliance via a one-time report. So instead of reporting your emissions year after year, for certain affordable housing and houses of worships, it's just a one-time report. And as long as you maintain that ownership structure or your affordability status, you're good with Local Law 97. And you can either demonstrate that in 2024 you meet that more stringent 2030 emission limit, or you can implement what is known as the prescriptive energy conservation measures. Those are 13, high performance building measures that one would do, implement lighting, implement boiler controls, make sure that pipes are insulated, putting a, boiler jacket over to make sure that it's insulated. The list goes on. So I would like to go to the next slide where I can talk about some considerations. This first bullet here, owners demonstrate compliance with annual greenhouse gas limits. You define your limit by how big the building is. So generally speaking, the larger it is in terms of its gross floor area, the more emissions are allowable. And this is certified by a registered design professional. So all building owners and stakeholders that are going to be thinking about Local Law 97 compliance need to understand they have to bring in a new party into the mix. It's very likely that if you have a property management firm, that they work with one already and have been on your behalf. But I'd want to make sure that, they're vetted and that they know what they're doing because a registered design professional is going to be handling the filing on your behalf for, if it's year after year, if you want to, lock in a rate for the entirety of Local Law 97, Just so you know, a registered design professional is defined as a New York State licensed professional engineer or a registered architect. So actually, one of our panelists is a registered architect, so we can share his experience. The cost for non-compliance with your emission limit is currently priced at $268 per metric ton of CO2 over that limit. And you're paying that annually until you meet compliance with that limit. So it's very important to some of the deeply rooted real estate moguls are just considering how can I work in the price of these fines into the annual budgets. But my retort would be, why would you just pay the fines when you can reinvest it into your buildings and make it into an asset, start to see some return on investment there, and ultimately have a healthier living experience, a more comfortable living experience. But to each their own, I suppose. I do want to note that for Article 321, since it's slightly different than meeting that performance limit, there are, annual penalties just for failing to report and failing to comply with one of those alternate compliance pathways that I had mentioned. One other thing I want to note is that there are some additional alternative compliance pathways that very likely may apply to some of the buildings that you are aware of or that you're living in. As I mentioned, there's Article 321. The definition would be greater than 35% of the units subject to rent regulation, or if it's an HDFC co-op, or it has one or more units participating in a federal project-based housing program. So that's for Article 321. You have those two alternate compliance pathways I had mentioned. There's two others that more so act as a delay. So if your building has at least one or up to 35% of units subject to rent regulated accommodations, you actually get a 2-year delay on your local law compliance requirements. Your first year of reporting will begin in 2026. So that's when your first year of compliance starts. You're filing that first report the following May. In general, all of local laws are filed, staggered. So you're always reporting the previous year. It's a bit complicated, but we'll get to that in a moment. And then lastly, I do want to touch upon a more lucrative delay, which is called the 2035 pathway, generally, reserved for Mitchell-Lama status buildings and, other various income restricted programs. For that, your first year of compliance starts 2035, with that first report again due that following year. So again, going back to that point, it's all very much going to depend on your individual building and the ownership structure. Here's just a very brief visual on the timeline that comes from the New York City Department of Buildings. I just want to note right here, the second bullet point, there are some instances where there are two or more buildings on the same tax lot. So when those buildings together exceed 50,000 square feet, it would be generated onto the covered buildings list. But a general rule of thumb is that whenever there is a building above 25,000 square feet on that tax lot, it is subject to local law 97. So it can get very complicated. There's a ton of discrepancies across public data sources, such as the New York City Planning, Zoning, and Land Use Map, the Department of Finance Property Information Portal, what the Department of Buildings has on their building information system. That's where I come in and I give you all this information unique to your building so that we can attempt to address and adjust if necessary. So as I mentioned, we're currently in that first reporting period in which the emission limits are set quite high with various intervals of 5 and 10-year periods until carbon neutrality in 2050. Now, a question that would naturally come is, where does my building stand? What am I emitting? And that's where we have various tools. This is from the New York City Accelerator. It's called the Building Energy Snapshot, where we'd be able to take that historic benchmarking data and generate a projection in terms of your emissions. It's a great starting off point. We also include various detail on your square footage, on your affordability and compliance status, etc. There's also a pretty dynamic tool that is available through the Building Energy Exchange, which is an organization that provides information and additional technical assistance more so related to building science as opposed to like hand-holding and advisory services. But they also have a pretty dynamic tool, and that is what I would be happy to go through anyone with in case you want to stay a little bit later and actually workshop some ideas or some troubleshooting for your unique building. Last piece of my presentation will, I'll touch upon various incentives and financing assistance just to get the ball rolling in terms of some of the sample projects that may be applicable. So for buildings that are already performing close to your 2030 targets, again, I'm thinking about those low-hanging fruit measures, maybe the behavioral changes that need to happen across all the tenants or dwelling unit owners, thinking about easy low, no cost things to do. Invest in maintenance, install low flow aerator devices for faucets and shower heads, air sear the building, do some minor tweaks to the heating system, make sure pipes are insulated, add a control panel. Think about, is the radiator in tune with, optimal steam traps or controls on the distribution, and of course, lighting improvements. For buildings that are significantly underperforming, that's when we'd start to think of some more holistic building wide measures, such as what improvements can I make to the building envelope at large? Is there an opportunity for spray foam insulation, replacing the heating system with a more efficient one, advanced controls and sensors, or even separating out the domestic hot water from the heating system and thinking about an electric option? That way you can take advantage of some very generous deductions that the Department of Buildings has put out for early adopters of heat pump technology. And then for the worst percentile of buildings, we're really thinking about windows and we're really thinking about heat pumps. I should just add not just heat pump water heaters, but heat pumps for space heating and cooling. My apologies for that. So it would be very difficult to list each and every incentive program that's available in the New York City market because it changes every year. They run on program cycles. So in general, there are different incentive programs for commercial and affordable housing, market rate buildings, new construction. There's various categories of incentives. So it's not just a lump sum. It could be, but it's also based off of the energy saved or by project type. There's also, announcements for bonuses, limited time offers, nice adders, neighborhood specific programs, perhaps correlated with demand response and demand reducing measures. There's grants, there's tax credits, rebates, abatements, various funding mechanisms. Solar is going away to an extent. There are ways to safe harbor incentives and tax credits. And heat pumps, as I mentioned, are on the rise. So that's where the New York State Public Service Commission has placed a mandate on Con Edison to really workshop their available incentive programs and make it more accessible for buildings to make that transition away from fossil fuels. So just to put a name to some of these programs, you can look up your utility, whether it's Con Edison for electric or gas. If you're a National Grid service territory, you can look into National Grid. And then for the state level, it's implemented through a pseudo government agency known as the New York State Energy and Research Development Authority. They even have incentive programs for studies, energy audits. You can get, between 50 to 75% of an energy audit completed and more. And then for financing, as I mentioned, it's really going to be project specific. It has to fit in with your building and financial structure. So for that, I can certainly follow up with you individually with one of our toolkits that kind of discusses different loan products at large. But just note that there are different requirements, different project cost minimums and maximums to be aware of, things like that. But that's where I come in to help you connect with those capital lenders once you have a scope of work, and we'll assess the options together with we have a financing specialist on staff. So you get that personalized assistance. So with that, I am completed with my presentation. I would like to invite some of our, fellow climate reality members to join me. Nikki, Minnie, and Kevin have all been making wonderful strides with local law 97 compliance for their own buildings. So I think it's time for us to have a little informal roundtable, if you will. So I will hand it over to Nikki first.
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Nikki. I am trained as a climate reality leader myself in New York last year. It was nice to see those of you there who I did. I am speaking about my role with the First Presbyterian Church in the city of New York. And I would like to, excuse me, sorry. I would like to start right off the bat by just mentioning that Joseph's point on compliance status is just absolutely. Can I pass it to Minnie while I get a glass of water? Is that okay? I'm sorry.
All good. Minnie, take it away.
Okay, sure. Hi, I'm Minnie, and I was trained in 2021, and Paul is actually my mentor, and I'm now part of the leadership team. So I live in an HDFC co-op. So HDFC stands for Housing Development Fund Corporation. And these buildings are income restricted, and its purpose is to make housing more equitable for lower, middle, and working class um, to essentially buy properties in the city. My role in the building, I'm currently the board president, but I have been on the board ever since I moved in. Climate change is obviously one of my passions, and so naturally, local law 97 became my responsibility on the board. In terms of what's been our building's local law 97 journey, through a project managed from our management company, we were connected with UHAB. So UHAB stands for Urban Homesteading Assistance Board. They are a nonprofit that supports tenants in cooperative home ownerships and NYC. And they offer a variety of services, for example, training on various topics of building governance. And they also have a climate and resiliency team that assists HGFCs with various electrification projects, for example, identifying incentives and financing options, as well as connecting buildings to their nonprofit partners and contractors for electrification work. And they're fantastic, and we're actually working with them right now on other electrification projects. When we were introduced, the first thing that we worked on was the weatherization assistance program for local law 97. And it has a huge intensive, but unfortunately our building didn't qualify because their income qualification is very low. And so we move on to plan B, where they connected us with another company, another organization called Cadence 15. And they are a climate focused startup that helps building put together a preliminary scope of work. And they use that to secure contractor bids. And we're actually working with one of the contractors right now toward compliance, and the actual work will begin this week. In terms of what role has our chapter and Joseph playing in our building's local law 97 journey, is that I first learned about local law 97 through our chapter, through back to Paul and Deepa. And then I was introduced to Joseph when I attended the office hour. And Joseph has been pivotal in helping us navigate the process and getting and securing support from our board and shareholders. For example, he mentioned earlier that he gave lots of board meetings, and one of them is actually our building. And then they also serve as a third-party reviewer, just to ensure that the organizations that we work with is they're legit, and then also that the scope of work that they provide us is reasonable. So which gave our shareholder the comfort, that we're in good hands, and that as part of our due diligence. So that's been a high level overview of what our journey's been like.
Wonderful. Nikki, everything good?
Yeah, okay now,
Okay,
thank you.
take it away.
Yeah. So I am speaking about my experience with the First Presbyterian Church in the city of New York, which on which I served. I served on the Board of Trustees for a 3-year term, and as president of its Board of Trustees for the last 2 years of my term, also as chair of its Buildings and Grounds Committee. With regard to the church's Local Law 97 journey, Joseph is obviously correct to spend some time dwelling on consideration of your compliance status. Most churches, I would expect most churches, certainly one would expect many churches to be subject to the so-called prescriptive pathway, which is a far simpler process than the performance pathway. However, I learned in one of the many presentations that the Accelerator has done that the so-called prescriptive pathway is available to houses of worship that the properties for which are 50% the occupancy is actually as a worship facility. The First Presbyterian Church in the city of New York is been around since 17 whatever. It's pretty old, like many old nonprofit type organizations. It owns a large piece of property. It operates one school on the property. Excuse me. And we're also a landlord to the city. There's a small public school that is on the property. Our C of O does not say that the First Presbyterian Church is actually a dominant church in terms of its occupancy. Our dominant occupancy is educational. So that having that immediate insight into, well, we're probably not on the prescriptive pathway was an extremely helpful value add from the Accelerator, because, if we had just proceeded without focusing too much, which candidly, I think the design professionals we were working with were not as focused as the Accelerator on this particular nuance. If we had just proceeded, what Joseph, your old colleague Larry had mentioned was like, well, what if they notice that you're making all of your other local law filings, which we do as a school, and then this one as a house of worship. So thank goodness for the Accelerator for helping us dial that in sooner rather than later. So my actual story on our projects has nothing to do really with those particular nuances. A church is just like any other old building. There's equipment, and equipment breaks down. And our domestic water heater, so the tap water heater, it literally blew its lid one day in May last year. And the building super, in a church context, they're called the sexton. The sexton comes in. I happen to be in the building, and he said, "The water heater broke. We got a new one coming in an hour. It'll be fine." Which would have meant we would not have transitioned from a fossil fuel piece of equipment to another fossil fuel piece of equipment. And no one would have thought much about it. The contractor that the sexton knew was not super focused on it. However, again, I happened to be sitting around, and the head of the business office at the church was also aware that we are looking to electrify. So we managed to be really nice to the schools and to the sexton and his family who live on the property, and all the other building users. There are also offices on the property, and to message to them that, hey, we're not getting a new water heater today. We're going to go for a heat pump hot water heater. We're going to go for the most efficient electric piece of equipment available. And again, the Accelerator was extremely helpful to us because we didn't know anything about heat pump hot water heaters. All we knew is that we didn't want to replace a fossil fuel piece of equipment with another fossil fuel piece of equipment. So our relationship manager, our account manager at the Accelerator gave us, within hours of when we reached out to her, a vendor list of people who could help with installation of heat pump hot water heaters. We called 5, 3 called us back, and we went with one of them, who was able to install this heat pump hot water heater, which required a little bit of electrical work. We were actually well set up to accommodate it, but it was not the most straightforward job, and it was a job that we really had to do in zero time, which is another reason, by the way, one might want to also sort of, keep in your memory Joseph's point about knowing the age of your equipment. We could not have necessarily foreseen this particular water heater failure. It turns out that the one that we'd had was a little bit too small for our particular uses, and so it was maybe unsurprising that it sort of reached its end of life a couple of years before we had expected it. But knowing where you're going before the emergency happens is the preferable course of action. But in our case, the accelerator was able to help us, even though we didn't know exactly where we were going. And I should say, Paul and Deepa were also very helpful in they helped me look at particular models of the water heater. The first version that was proposed by one contractor was a so-called electric resistance water heater, which is not nearly as efficient. So that's what I gotta say. The accelerator was a lifesaver, and we will benefit pretty big time from the available deductions, from the sort of reduction in penalties when we come up in 2030. So that is also a big benefit for us, in addition to just having fewer fossil fuels on our property.
So amazing. Thank you so much.
Sure.
All right, Kevin.
Hi, everyone. I'm Kevin Davis. I am a registered architect in New York State, and I have a firm based in Queens called KWDA. As Joseph mentioned, as a registered design professional, I've been helping buildings with their local 997 filings. The good news is, as Joseph also mentioned, most buildings are complying for now. But I think the one message I'd like to share is just to be clear that because your building is in compliance in terms of emissions doesn't mean you don't have to file. So that's the one thing I keep coming across with building owners in our neighborhood. I'm mostly working with market rate buildings, by the way, so that's kind of my niche. But yeah, you still have to file, and you do need an RDP to do that. So I've been helping with that service. It's a little complicated, so you're lucky that an RDP will do it for you. Lots of platforms to figure out, but anyway, that's my own cross to bear. But yeah, but just you do have to file, and the deadlines have been a little loose, right? You've got until August 29th if you need more time, so keep that in mind. And I'm sure Joseph will say that over and over as well. But yeah, it is doable, nothing to be afraid of. But knowing the situation that you're in with your building in terms of its emissions, how far away your building is from being in compliance is also something to start to be strategic about. If you're 5 years away, it's a very different scenario than if you're 15 away. So, as you look at replacing domestic hot water, for example, as Nicky talked about, all of those become factors as you plan ahead for your building's health.
Incredible. Thank you all so much. It is so empowering to be part of this group because I speak with building stakeholders all day, every day. It is what I do for a living, but I rarely am able to hear wins. And the fact that we have a small group within our own climate reality cohort that's actually doing the work in their own buildings or they're helping others is really cool. So I do thank you all. Paul, do you want to lead a Q&A session of sorts?
Yeah, thank you, Joseph. First of all, I just want to start by thanking you, Joseph, because that was a very enlightening presentation. It was very succinct, and I think it was very useful for the audience that are watching now or will watch later. So thank you for that very much. And I'd also like to thank the panelists, because those are some inspiring stories that you shared with us. And they show, as with everything in life, it takes individual initiative to make things happen. And so thank you for your initiative, and thank you for making that happen. So I have a series of questions that come from both the chat, that have come in through the chat, and also some that were submitted to us earlier. So I'm going to try to get through all of those in the time that we have. We only have 7 minutes left, so I probably suspect that we'll probably run about 5 minutes over that, and I hope everyone can stay on for that. So the first question comes from Nathan, and I think it's probably best for Joseph to answer this one. Is there a plan to let buildings connect into thermal energy networks to comply? I know that utilities are starting thermal energy network pilot programs.
There are pilots happening via Con Edison. I think that thermal energy networks would be an excellent solution, particularly if the buildings are like a campus style, or if there's a way to minimize the amount of drilling that would need to be involved, because now we're talking about geothermal, and that's one of the more expensive types of electrification due to cost of drilling. We're also a bit strapped for land in New York City. So that's why I'm really honing in on those outer borough, like garden style or campus sites. But you have to really engage with a reputable engineering and implementation firm, because it's going to be an incredibly uh, costly but also complex project, especially when you consider how to right size systems, how to, if is it going to be, is there existing duct work? Are you going to have to figure out if there's ways to connect it to existing loops? It's going to get incredibly costly and expensive. So that's like a plan of many that I think should be explored as you're considering options.
Okay, thank you, Joseph. And just on a technical point, on a follow-up, if a thermal energy network is put in place, then that would be carbon-free, I guess, method of heating, although the electricity comes from the grid. So I guess that because the electricity comes from the grid, that electricity consumption would be treated under the normal rules of Local Law 97 calculations, correct?
Yes, the grid coefficient for electricity is, it's a long string of decimals. It is set to reduce by half starting in 2030 to reflect the progress of the state level renewable energy goals. So the CLCPA is aiming for 70% renewable grid by 2030 and 100% by 2040. The Department of Buildings has put the 2030 portion into the rules to allow people, um, you know, the information to provide adequate planning. Um, TBD as to whether that will continually go down to carbon neutrality. That's certainly the goal, but we have to think about what's happening with offshore wind. We have to think about what opportunities there are for enhanced geothermal, hydro, things of that nature.
Okay, thank you very much, Joseph. And the next question comes from Paul Kiesler, 2 or 3. There's a few of us on the call because I shared my Zoom login, so I apologize for that. And this other Paul would like to ask a question to Nikki. Can you share what incentives or financial programs you were able to use for your project? And
Sure.
do you still have fuel use on site for heating?
Yeah. Um, that's the major drawback of doing work in an emergency, is that there was no time. The water heater blew up on a Monday and we had the new water heater installed by Friday. And even that had building users antsy. Candidly, it was not a huge expense within the institution's budget. We could manage it. It certainly would have been preferable, to use incentives. This particular institution is eligible for, sorry, my 4-year-old's headphones have been hooked up to my laptop. Sorry. We are, this particular institution, we are eligible for certain Con Ed incentives. And I guess if I might not fully and more fully answer the question, one benefit about doing domestic hot water is not a big sort of draw. It was not a huge draw in the balance of fossil fuel consumption in the property. We just don't use a whole bunch of hot tap water. They're not people taking showers all the time and things like that. But an additional benefit that we had not considered in the sort of emergency timeframe in which we were doing the project is that it gives you some skin in the game. We put something out in the church newsletter about holy heat pumps, and we sort of tried to message that we're trying to do the green right thing in communities of faith. Many communities of faith have, very strong feelings about being good stewards of of the earth and all things in it for the benefit of the future generations. So something that did come of that, some financial incentives that did come of that have been extremely generous. Following that, successful project, we were subsequently introduced to a local nonprofit that only works with faith institutions, and was making grants for churches that were looking to do decarbonization studies, which is going to be a more sort of full-scale study than you would get in, say, a local law 87 audit. We also do local law 87 audits. So we got a very generous to do that, which was completed and issued about 6 months ago. Shortly following which, we were sort of nudged toward a NYSERDA heat recovery grant program, which covered 75% of the cost of doing a design schematic to implement some of the recommendations that were set forth in the decarbonization study. And those are for us, very, very meaningful dollars. So what did we get for the actual hot water heater? Nothing, and maybe an extra wrinkle for the business office and for me, as people were asking when the new one would come in. But we got an awful lot of we've gotten sort of an awful lot of momentum out of that one small project, which has come in the form of real dollars.
That's super, Nikki. Thank you. And I think that brings up just 2 points that have been mentioned at other points in this conversation, which is it's great to get that plan done that Joseph referred to, and that the accelerator can help co-ops, condos, build any buildings, get that plan done. And the accelerator also has a full list of incentives. So planning in advance always helps you be prepared for those emergencies. The next question is a bit of a softball for Joseph. And it comes from Nancy. Thank you, Nancy. And she asks you, Joseph, how many staff persons are there in your office? You sound like the one that does all of this.
I'm passionate. I'm a climate reality project leader, like that. There's a reason why. We have between 10 and 15 account managers, each with a specific niche: affordable, house of worship, CNI. I like my niche is probably like market rate, multifamily, co-ops, and condos, but I can pivot depending. Um, right now, there was a slide earlier with like nearly 90% of buildings are projected to be compliant with the first emission limit. Right now, I'm helping out that extra 10%, and it's like a majority of like manufacturing buildings that just have very energy intensive operations. Hilariously enough, today I spoke with a Krispy Kreme manufacturer warehouse. I'm hoping to do a site visit. But I can pivot. I would just say I put a form in the chat. That way I can get just very briefly your name, email, building address. If you don't want to share it at this moment, that's fine. Just put in NA. It would be helpful if I can understand your relationship to the building, whether you're a tenant, renter, co-op shareholder, condo owner, if you're a board rep, president, or if you're a property owner, manager, or even a business owner. I'll email you tomorrow and we could discuss your specific situation and some options to consider. I also put my direct email there, um, because I do think that it requires that one-on-one kind of approach. But I
Super.
will be happy to work with everyone here, so you don't have to go through the motions of getting connected to another account manager, because then you'll get that personalized touch from me.
Super. Well, thank you for that, Joseph. And if anyone is watching this video after the fact, I would encourage you to email Joseph as opposed to filling out that form, just to make sure that he gets in contact with you. And the next question that we have here, I'm going to direct to Minnie, because the question is, I'm not on my board. How did you get co-op board members or other residents to support your efforts? So Minnie, like if being on the board, maybe you could give us insight into, and the president of your board, how would members of your building raise this issue with you and got you to take action?
So I actually, this initiative was started with actually I learned it from you guys about Local Law 97. And so I just like drove this initiative at my building. And so in terms of how to get the support is, Joseph gave the presentation and that added urgency to the need that we have to comply. And so the board's like, okay, this is good. And so that's when I start, owning that task as my primary responsibility on the board. In terms of convincing the shareholder is that it's to provide them with transparency. So I was very communicative with like everybody. And it's like, these are the companies we're working with. I mean, sorry, these are the organizations to work with, and what would the scope of work be entail. And then additionally, that I told everybody that we are also performing our side due diligence as in getting a third party reviewer, and Joseph was the person that I told them would be our reviewer for the scope of work, and just to make sure that the organization and individuals that we work with are legit, and that provided comfort for our shareholders. Like, okay, fine, Minnie and board, we're good with whatever you guys are doing.
Super. Okay, the next question, it comes from Chauncey. Hi, Chauncey. And this is directed to Joseph. And the question is that, he mentions that the board would be ready for another meeting with you if you have the time. He also is working with UHAB and Solar, UHAB, which I think Minnie mentioned she was working with, and Solar One, which is a provider of solar, and but really needs additional support to make sure that we can transition to electric. So he's just asking you to, if you can reach, if you're available. And my recommendation on that, maybe to answer for Joseph, is just maybe to fill out the form or to send the email, or how would you like to handle
Yeah,
that?
I'll make a note of that. We've spoken before with Chauncey, so this is great.
Okay. Super. The next question is from Haim, and again, it's probably for you, Joseph. The question is, does the Accelerator help properties project long-term cost savings through energy improvements in relation to first costs for equipment, installation, and systems? And this question might also be a good follow-up question for Kevin as well, as a design professional.
Yeah, we are working on developing a tool or platform that allows building stakeholders to conduct various scenario analyses. So the major gap in this process that we have realized is that there's so many disconnected parties involved. Unless you have a true one-stop shop vendor that will walk you through everything, they'll do your audit, they'll do your filing, they'll design a system, they'll sub it out, do it in-house, or manage the RFP for you. Oftentimes, building stakeholders are left to fend for themselves, and it's difficult to make these decisions just based off of the interpretation of an audit. A lot of the people that are in the, seat of a board, are doing this on their free time as a volunteer, of course. So they don't speak this type of language. So right now we're working on a tool that will allow individuals to look at what would the savings and what would the outlook be if I pursue this measure. Let's say it's a high efficiency natural gas boiler versus full or partial electrification. What would the baseline be? What would the savings be if I just make that upgrade? Or what would the baseline and savings be if I make this transition to electrification? Okay, so now we're talking about what happens with Con Edison rising costs of electric delivery. But we're also talking about savings based off of less input energy, assuming you have an airtight building envelope. And we're also factoring in avoided greenhouse gas emissions and the associated fines. So there's a lot of new factors that are going into this decision making that could, of course, be applied to the measures that you had listed, insulating systems, etc. So we're working on that, and it should be live in the coming days, week or two. So I will happily share that information with you. Please just shoot me an email, and we'll get it out. But Paul, you're right. There are vendors that are doing that, of course.
Mhm.
You may want to look into a more high level energy audit. Like an ASHRAE level 3 energy modeling could be the way to go. Given that you can leverage the NYSERDA Flex Tech that could be the best way to project out the cost benefit and savings of a proposed project.
Okay. And then the last question that has just come through in the chat relates to, and it actually came through as a question from, that was submitted earlier, which is related to the effect of the recently passed legislation, the mega law that was passed on July 4th, and which, as we know, gutted a lot of the IRA tax benefits. And so they're looking, Nancy was looking for, how much of an effect is that going to have on this transition?
Yeah. I'm admittedly still working through all of these changes. There's there's 25D, there's 45E as it relates to solar, residential and commercial. There's a hard stop at if projects are not installed and operating by end of this year, it's off the table for residential projects. But if you are a commercial operating as an LLC, or you're working through perhaps like a solar lease or a power purchase agreement, there are ways to get extensions and safe harbor. But there's also, some talk about if you're able to put out 5% of the project costs and labor, you can safe harbor to get some additional time on your hands. In general, what I'm seeing is that this big ugly bill has really put a hammer in the solar industry. However, as it relates to Local Law 97, localized city decarbonization, um, you can still, of course, install solar. What this will just do is spread out the return on investment and add a few years to that payback. However, there's really no other way to combat against Con Edison's rising cost of delivery aside from considering solar. I'm also starting to consider ways to, there's a very long wait list for community solar, but now I'm starting to think about leveraging time of use rate plans, or perhaps, in Westchester, there's a firm known as Logical Buildings that has like a grid reward program. There could be similar ways to do demand response to try to combat the rising costs of electricity. As it relates to Local Law 97, um, the grid is going to be, greening incrementally over the, span of the next however many years. There's no opportunity to deduct the additional solar that you're exporting into the grid after 2030. So, and when the grid coefficient for electricity reduces in half, the benefit that one would have from renewable electricity is in turn also reduced by half. So when you're talking about moving the needle the furthest as it relates to your long-term Local Law 97 compliance, it's really, in my mind, about two things: ensuring that you have proper insulation and airtight building envelope, and you're minimizing or transitioning away from your fossil fuel consumption, because number four oil, number two oil, and natural gas have heavier, higher emitting greenhouse gas coefficients. So the more you can reduce or eradicate those usages, the better. So it has a influence as it relates to costs, but not as it relates to 97 compliance. And this being said, the majority of the incentives that are on the table through Con Edison, National Grid, and NYSERDA, the state, are localized. They're not going to be affected by anything federal because it's private or state run. So in fact, we're going to see an enhancement of those envelope and electrification incentives over the span of the next 4 years, 2026 to 2030.
Right. Okay.
Could I chime in with two little footnotes on that?
Yes, Nikki.
For the big bad bill, for anyone working with nonprofits, other tax exempts, the direct pay option under the Inflation Reduction Act, which effectively makes an equivalent incentive available to a tax exempt that a taxable entity would have benefited from. That's also mostly going away by year end. So realistically, for anyone who wants to be doing anyone associated with a nonprofit or tax exempt who wants to be doing availing themselves of these of the IRA, you need to probably get something executed by October 1 so that it can be in whatever the term is. It could be mostly under construction by year end. And if I could also, I wanted to add one other footnote, if that's okay. At 741, one of the Paul Kieslers accurately observed that there are concerns around the grid being able to
Yes.
meet electrification requirements. And I'll just say, churches often have a lot of cubic footage within our church we have not yet transitioned off of a boiler to heat pumps. However, it's an issue. Churches that have rushed or been rushed into, it's churches that have sort of tried to prioritize electrification over envelope improvements have found themselves with really high costs that are not realistic in the long term. Undertaking envelope improvements, per Joseph's comments, is just critical to do before electrification work. That's the insulation and the air sealing, which can just be things like weather stripping, making sure there's nowhere for drafts to get in. Those are the two things I wanted to add.
Thank you, Nikki. I just want to talk about those 2 points because that was the last question that we had. And just for clarification, my understanding is that direct pay does remain after this year. It was
It gets a lot harder. Yeah, it just
for those of you who would like to know more about this, of the details of the big bad ugly bill or whatever you want to call it, there's a great podcast out this week called Shift Key with Robinson Meyer and Jesse Jenkins from Princeton, and they go through all of it. And there's also a great article in Canary Media that was recently put out as well. And the summary of what is happening is that all of the incentives that are kind of for individuals, are going away. So solar, EVs, home energy efficiency, and then some of the kind of corporate incentives for building, solar and wind are staying for a little while, for a few more years, and then all of the incentives for like batteries, hydro, geothermal, and nuclear will be staying as they were in the IRA. So, but those things that are kind of sticking around aren't really relevant for buildings. And as Joseph said, I don't think that the U.S. incentives were ever really a big part of the funding mix for local law 97 compliant buildings. So at least in the context of this discussion, it might not have been such a large impact. And then with regard to the question that Barry, I've identified that the other Paul is named Barry, or one of the other Pauls is named Barry. And he asks, what concerns are there about the grid meeting building electrification requirements, especially now that the federal solar and wind incentives are being reduced or eliminated? So yes, with those incentives for solar and wind being eliminated over the next couple of years for commercial projects, there is a concern that the price of electricity will increase because of that, because the supply of electricity will be less, and gas turbines are not available, so they can't make up that electricity with gas because there's a 6-year wait for those. So there's probably a period, thanks to this legislation, where electricity rates, supply rates, will be increasing in the future. However, there are not really any serious scientists or the federal state, the NYSO, New York State independent system operator, also confirms that there's not a concern about electrification. They do their annual outputs or projections over the future, and the main thing that's saving us for the next probably 10 years is that our peak electricity is always in the summer because of the air conditioning. And as we're electrifying, we're actually electrifying more heating. And a lot of the projects that local law 97 applies to actually just improve efficiency, which reduces electricity use as well. So they don't expect that our winter peak will match the current summer peak for another 10 years. So there's very little serious discussion around a concern about the availability of electricity. There is a lot of discussion around the cost of that electricity. So, and I think that's it. There might be some questions coming in, and unfortunately, I think we're out of time. We're now at an hour and 20 minutes so into this conversation. I'll take a look at those questions that are in the chat that may still be there unanswered. Please feel free to, contact Joseph directly if they relate to him and his work. If not, I'll try to get them out into the Reality Hub after we post this recording. And just with that, I'd like to thank everyone involved, especially Deepa Prasad, who pulled together this esteemed set of panelists and speaker. And I'd like to thank all of our speakers and tonight. And I'd like to thank all of you who tuned in and who may tune in the future. Thank you very much, and I hope you all have a nice evening. Good night.
Thank you.